In this video, I'm going to show you some simple techniques and some features you can use in Lightroom in order to take your woodland images from looking like this to something like this. We'll explore some basic color theory and the importance of this in your woodland images and how you can use that to create contrast and interest and also to create some atmosphere. And we'll also take a look at how the adjustment of clarity can play an important role in the editing of your woodland images. I recently found my new favorite type of landscape photography. It's something that made a lot of sense to me. It was a combination of two things that I really love. One, of course, being photography, and the other is to do with being in the woodlands, being in the forest. When I was a kid, my parents, they had a forest near the garden, and I spent many hours playing in there when I was a kid with friends, with my family, and just exploring it by myself. So I've just always loved being in the woodlands, and I feel very at home and very relaxed when I'm there. So this combination of two passions, two things that I love, it just made perfect sense. I was instantly hooked on woodland photography. And so I've been out many times recently, and I've taken pictures of trees and woodland areas in lots of different weather conditions, different times of the day. And when I got back to the editing process over in Lightroom, I noticed there was quite a few things which I was doing time and time again to enhance certain aspects of the images and to get across the feeling I wanted the viewer to have when I presented the image. And so I want to share some of these tips and tricks with you today so that hopefully you can enhance your images also, and you can come away with an image that more represents what you saw and how you felt on the day. And the reason I say what you saw and what you felt is actually my first bit of advice, which is before you start just going away and messing with all of the adjusters in Lightroom and changing everything, it's to take a little step back and have a think about what it was about that tree or that area of woodland that caught your eye, that made you want to take a photo of it. And what were the feelings you had when you saw it? Was it kind of a mysterious image? Was it quite cold? Was it a winter's morning? Was it warm? Did you want it to look kind of ethereal and mysterious? And I think it's really important to think of some of these words and some of these feelings because they should be used to help guide your image, to help represent what you want to get across in it. And to explain this a bit more, I think we can hop over into Lightroom now, and I'll tell you a bit more about what I mean. To help explain this a bit more, I'm going to load up what I call my mental notepad. So what I do is when I look at my image just before editing it, I make a few notes. What are the main colors, the main themes, and the main emotions and feelings that I want to get across in it? In the case of this one, for the colors, it was these amazing orange leaves on this tree, and I noticed a lovely warm orange glow coming up from this carpet of leaves on the floor. So I shot this in quite a flat profile and quite neutral. But on the day, what I remember was this lovely blue and teal colour which the fog had in the morning light. So that's definitely something which I'd note down and I know that I want to get across in the final image. It was also quite a soft, dreamy image. So again, that's something that I want to get across in the edit for the final viewer to experience. So here's another one with some birch trees in the snow. And for this one, at the time, obviously, it was quite a cold, crisp morning, but also I was thinking of a winter wonderland. I was thinking of blues, just to get across that cool feeling. It had a soft kind of magical look to it. And that's how I felt on the day when I took it. So I just keep those in mind prior to the editing. Here we have one final image just to demonstrate this process a little bit more. And for this one, the main notes that I had were, this was taken just before sunrise and this fog had an amazing blue glow to it. I wanted the feeling of moonlight. I wanted coldness, but also richness to the colours, and also the greens of the moss. And the whole sequence felt a bit spooky and a bit dreamlike to me. So that's things that I keep in the back of my head, and that's the feelings and the colours which I want to get across in my final image. Now I've explained a bit about the feeling and the emotion of the image. It's a good time to now show you the first tip within Lightroom which you can use to enhance your images. And this is using selective color masking to enhance just very specific parts of your image, such as leaves or bark. So let's hop into Lightroom and I'll explain a bit more about what I mean and how you can use it to bring out certain parts of your image. Okay, now that we're over in Lightroom, I can show you how I use selective color masking in order to enhance certain parts of my woodland images. And if you remember this image from earlier in the video, one of the main things I noted down were these amazing golden leaves, and that's one of the main things I want to enhance and get across to the viewer of the image. In order to do this, we're going to select a radial filter. Now everything I'm about to show you also applies to the gradient filter, it's just I more commonly use the radial filter to make these kinds of adjustments. Now, if we select and drag the mask over the area we want to affect, in this case the leaves, you can see that in this green area, everything that's highlighted in green is going to be affected by the adjustments we make here. And as we just want to affect the leaves, we need to be a bit more selective about what we're masking. So to do that, if we scroll down here and we select color, and then this eyedropper will appear. And then if we click on the leaves, you can see now just the leaves are selected. In order to select a slightly wider range of colors, we can drag and drop the eyedropper tool like this. Now you can see a much wider range of colors are selected. The problem now though is the bark is also selected and some of the trees in the background. So what we need to do is change the sensitivity of the mask. To do this, we use this slider here. So if I push it in this direction, it makes a wider selection, and now we can see even more of the bark and the surrounding trees are selected. But what we want to do is decrease the sensitivity until just the leaves are selected. That looks about right. Just to demonstrate, I'll show you what happens when we push it too far this way. See on the edges, some of the color of the leaves is no longer getting picked up by the mask. So we want to push it up a little bit more. There we go, just to make sure we've got all of the leaves selected and all of the colors within those. Now that we've got our leaves selected, we can make the enhancements. And as it was the warmth and the brightness of these leaves that we wanted to get across, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to push the warmth up on the temperature just a little bit. You need to be quite subtle. So around 11 looks good. And then also I want them to pop off the picture a little bit more. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to increase the whites a little bit. So say, again, you want to be quite subtle. Let's say about 12, maybe down a tad, 11. You can also do this with exposure or highlights. I found when I've used the exposure tool, it occasionally washes out the colors. And as the colors are very important to this selection, I've gone for the whites instead. I'll just quickly turn the mask on and off so you can see the difference that it makes. And I'll put it back on. So as you can see, it's quite subtle, but it just adds a little bit of pop and a little bit of color to those leaves just to enhance those a little bit more so that the viewer's eye is drawn to those. Okay, that brings me on to the next bit of advice, which is to do with split toning in the image, or as it's now called in Lightroom, color grading. And if you've played around with this at all, you'll know that this is to do with adding certain colors or tints to either the highlights or shadow regions, and now it's possible to also add them in the newer versions of Lightroom to the midtones. And there's a couple of little tips and tricks and pointers I've noticed from editing certain woodland images, which I want to share with you now and explain a bit more about colors and complementary colors over here. In order to explain how you can apply color theory to your woodland images, I'm going to bring up the notepad again, and on there you should be able to see the color wheel. Two main areas of color theory which I use frequently in the editing of my woodland images are complementary colors and harmonious colors. Complementary colors occur on the opposite ends of the color wheel. So examples of these are blue and orange, purple and yellow, green and red. Harmonious colours tend to sit close to one another on the colour wheel, so examples of these could be blues and teals or oranges and yellows. As I explained, these are just two very simple applications of colour theory which I use frequently in my woodland images, and you can go much more in depth into it. In order to help explain how I apply colour theory in my woodland images, I've got the first image which I showed you up on the screen now, and this is a perfect example of when I would use complementary colours. So I've just loaded up the color grading tool here on Lightroom, and you can see the color wheels are here again. And the color grading tool, it allows you to apply different colors to the midtones, the shadows, or the highlights. A good tip with woodland images which are taken in the fog, like on this one, is that your highlights will nearly always be the foggy area. And if you remember from my previous notes on this image, the mental notes I took, I noted that the fog had a kind of blue or teal hue to it, which is perfect because if you remember, the opposite colours are complementary, and the opposite of teal and blue is this nice orange color here. And as you can see, the leaves have this lovely crisp orangey yellow color. So by applying a blue color to the highlights, we can help these to pop off and create some complementary colors. I'll show you what I mean. I'm just going to add in a very subtle amount of blue, kind of a bluey teal tone, just like that, to the highlights. As you can see, just by turning this on and off, you can see that's already helped to separate out these gold leaves, and it's created a complementary color relationship between them. What we can also do is, if you remember, I also noted that the leaves on the floor had a kind of golden glow feel to them. And if I just take this shadow slider here, I can just add in a very small amount of orange, just like this. And as you can see, these are kind of the darker regions of the image, and this is where this will apply. Again, I'll just turn this on and off so you can see. We've created some complementary colors between the darker shadow areas, so the bark and the leaves, and the lighter highlights in the fog. So that's another good tip, is quite often your ground or your bark of your trees will be represented in the shadows. And if you want to add kind of a warmer tone to those, or bring out some of the woody tones in the image, this is one way you can do it using the color grading tool. Let's move on to another image to show you a bit more about color harmony. So to show how I'd apply harmonious colors to this image, I'll just load up the color grading panel again. And this time again, we're going to add in some blue to the highlights, because if you remember, I said I wanted to create kind of the feeling of nighttime, a kind of moonlight sort of feel to it, and a little bit of a kind of cool horror element. I think about there looks good. You can see that's already starting to sell the kind of moonlight look to it. Now, if you remember also, I said I quite wanted to bring out the greens of this moss down here. And green also works quite well in woodland photos to create a kind of more horror, mysterious feel, kind of slightly enchanted look to the images. So I'll just go ahead and apply that now. I'm going a bit more towards the green this time. I think around there looks quite good. You can see this is kind of staying in the blues and the green region. And then just to finish off the overall look, the kind of horror nighttime look, I'm going to just add a bit more of a blue-green in here. I'll just usually move it around a bit just to see what looks best. So I think about there looks pretty good. Maybe down a bit. There. And I'll just turn that on and off, and so you can see the difference. So there's before and there's after, and you can see those greens and blues. They work together to just create this kind of atmosphere in the shot. And that's just one application of harmonious colors. And I've opted for kind of cooler colors here, because that's the kind of feel I wanted to go for the image. But you can equally apply kind of warm colors as well. So oranges and yellows, that may work well more if you've got a kind of autumn scene. So I hope that shows how you can use both complementary colors to bring a bit of dimension and separation to your trees and maybe the background, and also just create a more pleasing looking image, and use harmonious colors to create kind of atmosphere and a certain feel to the images.
The next tip I have is to do with the clarity of the image. And if you're anything like me, when you first got into photo editing, one of the main things you'd want to do is just whack the clarity up all the way to the maximum. In fact, I found that softening a woodland image more often than not yields much more pleasing results. I'll explain a bit more what I mean with some images over in Lightroom.
To help demonstrate how sometimes the reduction of clarity can actually be quite beneficial for your woodland photos, I've got a few images loaded up, and I'll just go through and show you a couple of different ways which I commonly use to soften the image, and I'll explain why I do that and the effect that has on the look and the feel of the image. And one of the most obvious ways you can do that is, of course, by coming down here and making a global adjustment to the clarity. And if you remember just earlier, I was saying how it's really tempting, especially when you first get into editing, to increase the clarity all the way, or at least push it up quite a lot, because it makes everything look a bit more crisp. But you can see in woodland images, for example, this one, quite often that's really not what you want to do. I think part of the reason for this is, for example, in this image, we have so many different things going on, so many textures in the leaves here, the bark, and it's just
they're always tend to be quite busy, woodland images, even when you've got conditions like this. And when you put the clarity up there, it just creates too much visual noise and it's just distracting for the viewer. So I found more often than not in my images, I tend to just drop the clarity down just a tad. And it just adds this little bit of softness overall to the image. You don't want to push it too far either, or it starts looking like some sort of strange dream sequence from a film. I mean, if that's the look you want to go for, feel free. But for me, I tend to just go quite subtly. So it usually is around -5, -6 on most images. You don't want to push it too far. Then another way that you can introduce softness to the image, and it's not actually affecting the clarity of the texture as such, but more often than not, I also tend to increase the haze in the image. Even in a foggy image like this, I find it helps to add kind of a more magical, ethereal look to the image, which is what I want to go for in this case. And it also helps take away some of the digital sharpness from the image. So I'll just show you. I'll just drop this down again, very subtle. And as the name suggests, it just adds a little bit of haze, a bit of fog to the image, and it just helps to reduce the clarity a little bit. I'll quickly just set these to 0 so you can see the difference. Again, it's quite subtle, but you can see it's just added a little bit of softness all over the image. You can always bring back clarity to certain parts of the image. You could use the radial filters in a similar way to how I showed you before, or you could use the brush tool just to bring back in a bit of clarity to certain parts of the image if you feel like they're getting a bit lost. So that's one method of introducing softness into your woodland images, so using the global adjusters. But you can also make adjustments on a more local scale. So I very commonly will use radial filters to introduce some softness. So what I'll do is, maybe in the background here, I want to add a bit of lightness and a bit of softness. And I think this just adds to a kind of mysterious look to the image, which is, again, what I want to go for in this case. So what I'll do is I'll do a similar thing to what I did with the global adjustment, and I'll reduce the clarity and I'll bring the dehaze down. I'll be a little bit less subtle this time because I want to create kind of a mysterious area of intrigue in the image. And then also what works really well, if you just want to create a little bit of a soft light patch to the image, just bump the whites up ever so slightly, around 8. Now, if I just remove this, you can see it just added a bit of softness, a bit of extra fog to the image, and it kind of draws your eye in more to either your subject here and also down over into the background along this path. What you can do is you can also, again, use a selective color mask like I showed you before with the leaves, and you could select maybe just the foggy area. And that way you can see it's no longer affecting our main subject, this tree, as you might have introduced a bit too much softness and then it draws your attention away from it. So that's one way of introducing some additional softness to your image. Again, I'll remove that, I'll add it back in. And you can see it's just added this nice little glow here into the background. And I think it just helps add to that mysterious, ethereal look. So if you remember this image from earlier, this was the kind of winter wonderland scene with these amazing birch trees. And if you remember, some of my notes were about the soft white snow and the kind of magical feel. So again, this is another perfect example of when softening the image could be a great creative choice. Again, I'll make a global adjustment and I'll just take it down a tad. And you can see, if I also just introduce a little bit of dehaze, again, you don't want to go too far, especially with an image like this where a lot of it's white or close to white. Okay, and again, I'll just reset that and I'll put it back in again. And you can see it's just taken a bit of the edge, the digital edge off of some of these background leaves, and it's just taken away some of the sharpness. And I think it helps add to that kind of winter wonderland look, that feel. So yeah, if you always remember back to what it was, you know, the feeling or the look that you wanted to achieve in the image. And so in this case, just reducing the clarity a tad really helps. Again, let's try adding in the radial filter just to demonstrate the point once more. So let's just add it kind of into the middle of the image again. We'll just reduce the dehaze to create that little bit of fogginess, reduce the clarity, and bump up the whites ever so slightly. You want to be very careful on images like this with snow. If you push the whites up too far, you might blow the highlights. Great, I think that's about right. Okay, I'll just turn it on and off again because again, it's very subtle. But as you can see, it's just added a very slight glow, a little bit of softness around these, and I think that just helps to very subtly increase the kind of, winter wonderland feel of the image that I wanted to get across. So I hope that's helped demonstrate how reducing the clarity can help introduce kind of an element of mystery and interest to the image, while also taking off some of the digital edge and sharpness from all of the textures which are present. Of course, it will really depend on the image, and in some cases you may want to increase the texture and increase the clarity, but I've just found more often than not when I'm editing the woodland images, having that little bit of softness in there helps to kind of create a bit more intrigue into the images and helps create that mysterious feel that the woodlands quite often bring out for people. I hope you found these tips and tricks useful for enhancing your woodland photos. They're things I've used time and time again when editing mine, so I hope they help you to bring out certain aspects, colours, themes or emotions in them and give you an overall result that you're a bit happier with and more reflects what you saw and felt at the time when you took it. If you're someone who finds it a bit easier to follow along in writing the tips and tricks, I've actually created a PDF summarising each of them, which you can find linked below. So if you just follow the instructions there, and you should be able to get a copy of that. Thank you very much for watching this video. I hope you found it useful, and if you have, I'd ask if you can hit the like, the subscribe and the notification bell. I'll have lots more editing tips and tricks coming up. And we are actually in a lockdown at the moment in the UK, but as soon as restrictions are lifted and we know a bit more about what's going on, I want to get out and create some videos more about the image taking process as well as the editing. So thank you again, and until next time.